All right, so we're about to start the final part of the symposium. It's my absolute pleasure now to start these series of presentations that will be followed by a discussion by Rachel Kay and Alphonse Xu. We will start with Rachel, although I want to emphasize that this last segment was conceived with two researchers that have different approaches that work on different parts of Asia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, that question and problematize how these very regions are approached actually, and the myths that have helped to structure them, both in imaginaries, imaginaries, but also in their actualization. Spaces, they both have a very empirical approach through archival work, through field work, and tied to a reflection to these geographies that they explore, of these spaces that are subjected to the mythological machine imposed by a certain definition, a narrow definition of modernization, but also spaces that offer ways of resistance from these frameworks. So again, it's my pleasure to welcome Rachel first, Rachel Kay, who's a PhD candidate in social anthropology at the University of Cambridge, founded by the UK Economy and, PhD candidate in social anthropology at the University of Cambridge. Her research addresses experience of uncertainty and time among walnut traders in Central Asia, asking how these are produced by shifting political economies and ecologies. For this project, she carried out a long-term ethnographic research with people involved in the transactional trade of walnut from forests in Jalalabad region in Kirghizistan. She is interested in what it means to live with ambiguous plants, as she calls them, approaching this question through a methodological focus on emotional life. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Martin. As you said, I'm interested in questions of uncertainty and time, and in this talk I want to talk about how myths shape those in this particular context. So looking at relationships between people and the walnut forests, particularly with an emphasis on transnational trade, because that's one of the sort of main ways through which people relate to the forest now. So this is very much a project about the present, but with reflection upon history as well. So this is the walnut forests in autumn, which is the time of the harvest. And I want to show a map, not just to locate ourselves, but also to emphasize the borders, which are an unprecedented fragmentation of the Central Asian space. The nation state, I guess, as we've heard also throughout the weekend, is a kind of myth and also a violent myth. And so this is kind of just to frame Central Asia as a place with borders which appeared in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so where I was carrying out my research was in Kyrgyzstan. At the top right-hand corner of the map, you can see the borders are quite complex around here. And so I was in Jalalabad region, up in the mountains mostly. Specifically, you can see the walnut forests in green. And I spent most of my time in a town called Arslanbob, which is up in the mountains around Walnut Forest area, and also Bazar Korgan, which is down in the valley, which is a city where there is an international wholesale walnut market. But I'm mostly focusing on relationships between people living close to the walnut forests. So to give a bit more context, the walnut forest is state-owned, and there is a state forest enterprise which was set up during the Soviet time and remains today. And so now what happens during the Soviet time, it was a commons, but owned by the state. Now the land is split up into individual plots that locals rent from the state. So it's a very different system. Also, I mean, you can see as borders appeared in the region, also the land of the forest was fragmented into individual plots. So what happens is, this is also Arslanbob, where I was staying, and these are collecting walnuts in the forest on the left, and then on one side, I'm not sure whether left or right for you, and then this is also a walnut trader shop in Arslanbob. Yeah, so I want to talk about, firstly, the Russian imperial and Soviet myths, which have shaped experiences of time for people living with walnuts now. So the walnut forest area was annexed by the Russian Empire in 1876 as part of its gradual colonization of Central Asia during the 19th century. And following this, the Russian imperial administration took an inventory of the forest and decided that it was valuable for its regulation of the hydrology of the Fergana Valley, which, actually, let me just show you, can go back. So the Fergana Valley is the paler area in this map, and the walnut forests are around the edge of it. So it's been interesting how much water has come up this weekend, and this connection with water was actually really important for the fate of the walnut forests in a kind of slightly unexpected way, I guess you can say, because so the Russian imperial dreams for Central Asia were underpinned by this idea, which came up in the previous roundtable, that Central Asia was this area that was like an arid land, empty or populated by nomads, and kind of that needed to be made fertile and productive. And so there was this idea that irrigation was necessary for its future as part of the Russian Empire. And also that irrigation would make it civilized and bring nomads into a settled life. So it was kind of very similar to the colonial dreams that were discussed in the last roundtable, visions of a desert. And so they were both specific dreams around Central Asia, but also they channeled these modernizing dreams from across the world, or the idea of bringing prosperity to deserts through irrigation. So in the mid-19th century, also developments elsewhere in the world affected what happened to the forests, because the American Civil War caused the price of cotton to increase. And so the Russian Empire chose to make cotton the main cash crop for Central Asia's agricultural industrialization. And the Fergana Valley was chosen as one of the main places for cotton cultivation. So there was this recognition that the forests were necessary for regulating the water cycle in the Fergana Valley, because forests absorb water and then they store it and then they release it slowly. So at times of flood or times of heavy rainfall, they prevent floods from happening, and also at times of drought, then they release water slowly, so it kind of has this stabilizing effect. So that recognition was very important, because it resulted in the protection of the forests ultimately. During the Soviet era, there was, despite the recognition of the importance of the forest, there was actually still like the imperial and then the Soviet administration did carry out cutting of timber, even though they restricted local uses of the walnut forest. So it was very much like a top-down kind of restriction of local uses, but then also doing what they wanted. But ultimately there was a law passed that the forest would come under conservation, so timber, deforestation was banned basically, and it's because of that the forests are still there today. And I think that's quite, it's an interesting kind of ambiguous outcome of this very violent myth around needing to irrigate a desert, because one of the outcomes of it was actually that the forests are still there. So I think there's sort of, multiple outcomes of myths, and that's one thing that I want to highlight with this. Partly because of processes that were happening that were nothing to do with people, so the connection between forest and the water. So the forest persisted, but the relationships between them and people shifted with political economy. So during the Soviet time, the walnut forests became part of the planned economy. Forests were sent, the walnuts were sent across the Soviet Union, and the state forestry enterprise, which I mentioned, was set up to manage the forest, and there was a huge amount of investment into that. And also importantly, the state provided jobs for people both in forestry and in farming. And so with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of that was lost, the investment and the jobs. So it was like the loss of a myth of certainty, a certain future, also the loss of the reality of stable jobs and incomes. So people had to rebuild their livelihoods from scratch, which is kind of a familiar story across the post-Soviet space. And as I said, the collapse of the USSR involved the fragmentation of Central Asia into independent republics, and so the appearance of national borders. And this brought about a lot of disruption to economic and social life. And walnuts started being traded across borders, so this created a different relationship with the forests. And as I also mentioned, the forests were split up into individual plots of land, so they were no longer commons. So walnuts became very important, but also a very uncertain source of income. And one source of uncertainty is that the harvest is extremely unpredictable, because the forests are subject to the variabilities of weather and climate, and also other living beings like pests. So some years the harvest is huge, some years there's nothing. And so people have to live with that kind of variability. And in addition to this, climate change is also making the harvests, it's making poor harvests more common due to shifting weather patterns. And then another source of uncertainty is that walnut prices are very volatile because they're subject to the dynamics of global markets and geopolitical change. So there's kind of many sources of uncertainty in living with walnuts and in trying to find sources of income in this region. So I found that this variability created the possibilities of work and life anew every year. So when the harvest is good, people go to their plots of lands in the forest if they have one. And they camp there for up to a month. So it's a big shift in life. They relocate their lives to the forest temporarily. But then they couldn't be sure what the harvest would be like until it begun. So there was a lot of waiting to see. And when I spoke to people, they would say, like, we just have to go and check and see. So you couldn't really make plans before you knew what the harvest was like, before the moment of going to the forest. And also this was the same for walnut traders. They would say, like, we just have to wait and see. And if the harvest was bad, then they might say go to Russia for work and completely change their plans. So it was created a lot of disruption in people's lives, but then that also was quite ordinary because people found ways to live with it. So this all created this uncertain rhythm of life, which had embodied an emotional effect. So, for example, there's a lot of waiting, frustration, boredom, and then also disappointment. At the same time, hope, thrill, intrigue, excitement. So kind of this whole emotional landscape that comes from a certain political economy as well as the agency of the walnut forests. But whilst the walnut harvest and the walnut trade are very unpredictable, the forests are still there, and they have their own life and their own pathways, they generate unexpected things, and trees work according to different timescales than people, often quite unknowable, mysterious timescales, and also kind of what they generate is a bit mysterious and opaque. They also outlast political economic rupture. And sometimes people spoke to me of how, despite the unpredictability of the harvest and all the other unpredictabilities, collecting walnuts was still easier than farming because you don't have to do anything, you just go and collect. And I think for me in these words there was the sense of the forest as a kind of gift. And this sense is also present in a legend which everyone knows in Arslanbob, which is the town I was staying in, about how the forest came to be. And in this legend, the Prophet Muhammad commanded one of his disciples, called Arslanbob Atta, which is where Arslanbob's name comes from, commanded him to find a beautiful place and create a paradise on earth, and he gave him a walnut to plant there. And he went on a journey and found the place that is now Arslanbob and planted the seeds there, and that's how the forest came to be. So this legend actually has been generative of a new and more communal, I guess you can say, economic way of relating to the forest, because I was told that a few years ago in Arslanbob someone wrote a letter to the head imam saying, well, you know, actually the walnut forests, we've split them up into plots of land, but they belong to God. And so the people who rent the land should open up the land. And in response, the mosque and the state forestry enterprise and the local government jointly made a ruling that on the second month of the harvest, people would be allowed to collect wherever they wanted. So it was a partial shift in the relationship with the walnut forests. So I suppose what's apparent from this is that what myths actually generate is often shaped not only by the power of the myth itself, but also by other forces at work, other living beings, such as the walnut forests. And I think, you know, yesterday there was discussion of darkness, and darkness involves uncertainty. And in thinking about uncertainty, I've sort of wondered about how it both involves pain and also generates things that are nourishing, and being able to walk alongside uncertainty is a kind of openness to whatever things might offer you. And I think despite all the scarcity and loss with the forest continuity, there's something important. And there's a sort of this collapse of worlds, but also amidst that, the forest might have something to offer. Thank you.